before I get started, I should express my profound gratitude to my mentors, Dr. Ellsby and Dr. Schwab, for their generosity with their time and for their investment into the project. And I also want to thank Dr. Hoffman and Dr. Toole for agreeing to look at the project and give me feedback. We typically view death as bad for the one who dies. We not only take death to be bad for the one who dies when the process of dying is painful. Instead, we often view death as bad merely because it entails that the one who has died misses out on the good things they would have experienced had they not died. But we do not consider prenatal non-existence to be bad for the one who has been born, even when we consider that had one been born earlier or later, they might have had a better life. Call this the common intuition. Thomas Nagel describes the common intuition as, quote, the most perplexing feature of our attitude towards death, unquote. Lucretius, about 2,000 years ago, argued that because prenatal non-existence is not bad, neither is the post-mortem non-existence of death. The purpose of this presentation is to present the most popular responses to Lucretius, suggest that they are unpersuasive, and provide a novel response that shows why Lucretius's argument against the common intuition is uncompelling. The deprivation account is the standard account of the badness of death. Virtually all philosophers who argue for the badness of death give this account in some form or another. In its most general form, the deprivation account holds that death is bad for us insofar as it deprives us of the goods of life that we would have if we were to continue living. Death is not experientially bad. It cannot be experientially bad for the one who has died, since it entails the cessation of experience. Of course, death may be associated with experiences that are experientially bad. For example, dying may be painful, one may be anxious about dying, or one may be anxious about the fact that one will be dead. Yet, even in the absence of these associated experiences, death is usually considered bad. Imagine that a carefree college student suddenly dies. Her process of dying is painless, and she has no anxiety about death or how it finds her. But, it seems to me at least, her death is still bad for her. In contrast to locating the badness of death directly in experience, on the deprivation account, death must be identified as comparatively bad. That is, death's badness is not located directly in some pain connected to it, but in the comparison of the bads and goods of which it deprives us. In general, then, the deprivation account of death does not establish the necessary badness of death. It only shows that death is bad for one when one's overall life would have been better had it continued. Lucretius argued from symmetry that since we are not troubled by our prenatal non-existence, we should not be troubled by our post-mortem non-existence either. He writes, quote, look back at the eternity that passed before us before we were born, and mark how it utterly counts to us as nothing. This is a mirror that nature holds up to us, in which we may see the time that shall be after we are dead. Is there anything terrifying in this sight, anything depressing, anything that is not more restful than the soundest sleep, unquote. Fred Feldman expresses the Lucretian symmetry argument, or LSA, as follows. Premise 1, prenatal non-existence is not bad for us. Premise 2, post-mortem non-existence is the temporal mirror image of prenatal non-existence. Premise 3, if the first two premises are correct, then post-mortem non-existence is not bad for us. The conclusion, death is not bad for us. Nagel argues that while our death is contingent, our birth is fixed. In other words, Nagel contends that the boundary of post-mortem non-existence is a contingent fact, and the boundary of prenatal non-existence is a logically necessary fact. Nagel writes, quote, but we cannot say that the time prior to a man's birth is time in which he would have lived had he been born not then but earlier. For aside from the brief margin permitted by premature labor, he could not have been born earlier. Anyone born substantially earlier than he was would have been someone else. Therefore, the time prior to his birth is not time in which his subsequent birth prevents him from living. His birth, when it occurs, does not entail the loss to him of any life whatever, unquote. Nagel's argument relies on the plausible premise that one cannot be deprived of the logically impossible. Since the timing of a person's death is contingent, the life that she would have lived, had she not died when she did, is a life that she could have lived. But for Nagel, since the timing of her birth is a necessary fact, the life that we might try to imagine she would have lived is not in fact a life that she could have lived. It is not possible that she be who she is and be born earlier. Because it is not logically possible for her to be born earlier, she cannot be deprived of the life that she would have lived had she been born earlier. Nagel's response to the LSA fails since its central claim is false. The timing of one's birth is not a necessary fact. Even if we concede that genetic origin is essential to identity, the timing of birth or conception may be contingent. The temporal location of one's genetic origin is itself contingent. It is, for example, conceivable that the sperm and egg from which one is conceived begin to exist earlier. Belshaw and Kaufman rehabilitate Nagel's response to the Lucretian symmetry argument. They distinguish between our psychological, biographical, or thick selves and our metaphysical, or biological, or thin selves. While we can imagine our thin metaphysical or biological selves coming into existence earlier than they in fact do, our thick psychological, biographical selves are necessarily, causally tied to beginning when they do. Because the biographical histories, relationships, desires, plans, etc., that constitute our current thick selves depend on the particular contingencies of their temporal origin to emerge as they do, substantially changing when we began to exist would radically alter our present thick selves. By distinguishing between thick and thin selves, Belshaw and Kaufman reveal two possible symmetry relations. First, consider the asymmetry of prenatal and postmortem non-existence for our thick selves. Prenatal non-existence does not deprive our thick selves of anything, since they cannot begin to exist earlier. In contrast, postmortem non-existence may deprive our thick selves of goods, since they could continue to exist. This is Nagel's argument formulated in terms of our psychological, biographical selves. Second, consider the asymmetry of prenatal and postmortem non-existence for our thin selves. Both states of non-existence can deprive our thin selves of goods, since our thin selves can start existing earlier or cease existing later. Kaufman contends that in thinking about birth and death, we do not care about our thin selves but our thick selves. Thus, to evaluate prenatal and postmortem non-existence, the appropriate locus of our consideration is their value for our thick selves. Since our thick selves cannot begin to exist earlier than they in fact do, and since they can cease to exist later than they in fact do, prenatal and postmortem non-existence are relevantly different for our thick selves. Accordingly, the symmetry condition is false. Kaufman, it seems, has shown the Lucretian symmetry argument to be unsound. Belshaw and Kaufman's response to the Lucretian symmetry argument hinges on strong identification with our thick psychological biographical selves, in contrast to our thin metaphysical or biological selves, when evaluating the timing of birth and death. However, we do not care only about our thick selves. Suppose that I am dissatisfied with my present psychological biographical life. I do not have any personal or professional attachments or any hobbies that motivate me to continue on. My doctor offers me two options. I can be euthanized, or I can undergo therapy that will radically transform me into a different person with a different personality and with no remembrance of or connection to my current self. I, and many others, would prefer the second option. On Belshaw and Kaufman's approach, I should be indifferent to the choice between these two options, since both options are identical with regards to the fate of what I care about, my thick self. However, since the second option ensures some continued existence, whereas the first option entails none, I would prefer the second option. At least sometimes, it seems, we care about the fate of our thin selves when thinking about birth and death. Indeed, many find comfort in religious doctrines that their metaphysical selves will continue on after death. Pettygrove writes, quote, "In relation to death, it seems it is not just psychological extinction that we fear, but total extinction, psychological, physical, and metaphysical," unquote. While Belshaw and Kaufman have shown that the LSA is sound, the Lucretian symmetry argument is unsound when read in terms of our thick selves, their account cannot reject the symmetry between prenatal non-existence and postmortem non-existence for our thin selves. Barring some additional refutation of this symmetry, Belshaw and Kaufman's approach falls short of being a successful response to Lucretius's argument. Bruckner and Fischer argue that we have asymmetric attitudes towards pleasures. We prefer our pleasure to be in the future. In general, we have a bias towards having our pleasure in the future. Moreover, we are indifferent to past pleasures as such. Of course, we may enjoy remembering past experiences, but this matters to us only because it leads to present or future pleasures. Death deprives us of future pleasurable experiences, while prenatal non-existence merely deprives us of past pleasurable experiences. This grounds an important asymmetry between prenatal and postmortem non-existence. We care about the deprivation of the latter, while we are indifferent to the deprivations of the former. This explains the common intuition and entails the negation of the symmetry condition. It seems that Bruckner and Fischer have provided a successful response to the Lucretian symmetry argument. While Bruckner and Fischer have expressed how our attitudes toward past and future pleasures explain our asymmetrical attitudes toward prenatal and postmortem non-existence, they have not shown that our asymmetric attitudes are justified. Bruckner and Fischer argue, in response to this criticism, that since our general deep-seated asymmetric attitudes toward past and future pleasures are rational, our particular asymmetric attitudes toward prenatal and postmortem non-existence are rationally justified. For this response, and by extension Bruckner and Fischer's account as a whole, to be successful, our general asymmetric attitudes toward past and future pleasures must be shown to be rational. Appealing to an evolutionary point of view, Fischer outlines an approach to how our general asymmetric attitudes may be justified. Fischer suggests that those who care more about the future may be more successful at surviving and reproducing, and are thereby selected for by evolutionary forces. Further, caring asymmetrically about the future may lead to more happiness over time. One might object that Fischer's evolutionary argument could be employed to justify, say, xenophobia. Fischer responds that, quote, a good evolutionary argument, unquote, would not justify xenophobia. On the contrary, xenophobia could be shown to be disadvantageous across a wide variety of circumstances. Fischer's evolutionary argument does not show that our general asymmetric attitudes toward past and future pleasures are justified in a normative sense. Recall that the general context of this discussion is to evaluate the coherence of the common intuition in light of Lucretius's argument. The question is not whether the common intuition is evolutionarily beneficial or useful, but whether it is philosophically justifiable with regards to the demands of reason. The fact that our general asymmetric attitudes toward past and future pleasures may have evolutionary benefit cannot therefore ground in particular the rationality of the common intuition. Thus, Bruckner and Fischer have failed to show that Lucretius's symmetry condition is false. Lucretius's argument still stands in need of a critical response if we are to maintain the common intuition. In order to defend the common intuition against Lucretius, I propose the following asymmetry argument. Human action is oriented exclusively toward the future. If human action is oriented exclusively toward the future, we are oriented asymmetrically toward the past and future. If we are oriented asymmetrically toward the past and future, there is a relevant difference between prenatal non-existence and postmortem non-existence. Therefore, there is a relevant difference between prenatal non-existence and postmortem non-existence. My argument concludes that the symmetry condition, the premise in Lucretius's argument that our prenatal non-existence and postmortem non-existence are symmetric, is false. It follows that if my argument is sound, Lucretius's argument is unsound. I argue for the soundness of my argument by explicating and defending the plausibility of each of its premises. So to defend my premise that human action is oriented exclusively toward the future, I argue as follows. Our lives do not find us as passive observers. Instead, we actively put ourselves to our lives. Nagel writes, quote, "Human life is full of effort, plans, calculation, success, and failure. We pursue our lives with varying degrees of sloth and energy. Leading a human life is a full-time occupation to which everyone devotes decades of intense concern," unquote. Our lives are like a project in which we are perpetually engaged. In doing so, we dream, work, and plan for the future, aiming for a desired form of life. Typical examples of the end of human life include flourishing, pleasure, virtue, enlightenment, and financial or professional success. These are often propounded in conjunction with a corresponding theory of human welfare, for example, objective list theories, hedonism, desire fulfillment theories. For our purposes here, we do not need to commit to a specific view of the end of human life and are not bound to any corresponding theory of human welfare. For my argument, we are merely required to show that the ends of human activity are future and that this fact is normatively relevant. To defend my premise that if human action is oriented exclusively toward the future, then we are oriented asymmetrically toward the past and future, I argue as follows. Our lives are specifically oriented toward the future. Aristotle writes, quote, "To produce movement, the object must be good that can be brought into being by action, and only what can be otherwise than as it can thus be brought into being," unquote. This indicates a general asymmetric orientation of human life as regards the past and future. This general asymmetric orientation extends beyond the asymmetric preferences for future pleasures that we saw emerge in Bruckner and Fischer's account. This general asymmetric orientation to human activity is a result of temporal asymmetry. We cannot affect the past by our actions to bring something about. Thus, as beings that plan and act within the world, we are fundamentally oriented toward the future. To defend my premise that if we are oriented asymmetrically toward the past and future, there is a relevant difference between prenatal non-existence and postmortem non-existence, I argue as follows. Our prenatal non-existence is necessarily past, and our postmortem non-existence is necessarily future. Further, our postmortem non-existence necessarily deprives us of our future. Hence, there is a necessary difference between prenatal and postmortem non-existence. The former merely deprives us of past existence, whereas the latter always deprives us of future existence. Since we are asymmetrically oriented toward the future by virtue of the fact that our ends are future, there is a normatively relevant asymmetry between past and future non-existence. Therefore, Lucretius's symmetry existence, that postmortem non-existence is the temporal mirror image of prenatal non-existence, is false, and Lucretius's argument is unsound. The temporal asymmetry between prenatal and postmortem non-existence has normative significance, since the ends of human activity are located in the future. In short, the mirror of time does not reflect symmetrically prenatal and postmortem non-existence around one's life. In contrast to Fischer's grounding of our asymmetric attitudes in evolutionary advantage, my account relies on the nature of human experience and action to justify our asymmetric orientation. My approach thereby grounds asymmetric attitudes toward pleasure and pain as a special case of a more fundamental asymmetric orientation in human experience and action. In sum, my argument makes plausible the common intuition, the view that our death is bad while our prenatal non-existence is not. This account of the badness of death is a deprivation account, since it identifies the badness of death in the fact that it deprives us of future existence that we work toward in living. In short, Lucretius's argument fails to show that death is not bad and that we should not fear it. Instead, my argument makes plausible the view that our death is bad while our prenatal non-existence is not. Thank you.
If you guys have any questions, feel free to ask.
I guess I could talk while you're drinking.
Yep.
Thanks, I found that really interesting. I especially, and I think you were sort of nodding in that direction without actually using the word suicide, but it seemed like with the deprivation of pleasures, the implied question is, well, what about the person who has no pleasure in their life? So it seems to me that your hypothesis then would nod in the direction of suicide always being bad. So what do you have to say about suicide?
Yeah, so the deprivation account in general only says that death is contingently bad. So it's bad when if you do not die, when you do, your life would have been better. So if you commit suicide or die at all and your life would have been bad if you had not died then your death on the deprivation account or your suicide is not bad for you. Suicide could of course still be bad if your life would have been good, if you hadn't died when you did or something, but that's of course hard to say, right? It's hard to see into the future, yeah.
Well, but I guess what I'm asking is, do you want to go as far as saying, because of my theory, suicide is always philosophically bad?
Oh yeah, so it doesn't say anything about the badness of suicide with regards to death in general like that. So it doesn't say suicide is always bad because it entails death in general. It would only say suicide is bad insofar as it entails death when your life would have been good had you not died. So there might be other reasons though that suicide is bad, not because it entails this death, right? It might be bad because you violate some sort of law or something, some sort of moral law. So you might have other reasons besides just the non-existence of death that you think suicide is bad. But that's obviously beyond the scope of my research. So my research would just say that suicide is bad when it, because it entails death, it's bad when it happens when your life would have been good had it continued.
Okay, so because I was thinking your theory would suggest that because suicide is interrupting the future orientation, that's what makes it bad. It's interrupting the future orientation, the natural future orientatedness of a human.
So the future, that orientation is only good insofar as the goods that it's only good insofar as the sort of experiences and pleasures of the future that it makes possible or that it's oriented toward. So there's not a value in just being oriented toward the future as such. It's valuable because there are good things in the future that are made possible, yeah.
Hi, I'm Professor Toole. I've read your paper, but I don't think we've met.
Yeah.
So I really enjoyed the paper and I enjoyed your presentation as well. I have a question about your argument at the end. And one of the premises of your argument, I think, is that human action is oriented exclusively toward the future, I think. And so here's my question. I mean, is it really oriented exclusively and only and totally toward the future? I mean, I can think of times in people's lives, for example, where they're consumed by the past, consumed by regret, consumed by something that they did wrong, some way in which they wronged someone or some opportunity they missed, etc. Now, obviously, you could turn that around and say, well, what they're really talking about is how to make their futures better by sort of reconciling their emotions and sort of becoming happier, or at least and so I understand that, but I guess here's more fundamentally my question. Why do you need to say that it needs to be exclusively future-oriented? Can't we just say that human action is predominantly future-oriented? Because if all you're trying to do is show that there is indeed asymmetry, it doesn't have to be an all-or-nothing thing, right? All you have to do is show that people are primarily oriented toward the future, and shouldn't that be enough to say that post-mortem non-existence is worse than prenatal non-existence?
Yeah, so two things. So the first thing about whether it is in fact exclusively oriented towards the future. So yeah, there needs to be a qualification. So it's exclusively oriented towards the future insofar as its activity, insofar as it's an activity in action, it has to be future. But the reasons, although the reason is for future action, the reason might have something to do with the past. So there is of course a sense in which we care about the past. The asymmetry arises just when we think about action. So that's the first point about the exclusivity of the future orientation of action. So the second point about whether this is necessary, I don't know if it's necessary, but one concern, if we say that, well, most of the time we're oriented toward the future in this way, a concern that I would have then is how we justify that predominance in our concern for the future as opposed. So the benefit of my argument is that I argue from the nature of our experience and our sort of the way we experience time, that this sort of thing it's not irrational at least, right? And so because of the way that we experience the world, because we can only affect the future, I argue that this is a sort of necessary part of our lives. This is just a feature of our lives as such. And so if we lose that, if we weaken that, it might still work. You might be able to still make an argument, but there would be more concerns about how you show that that's justified. You might just say, well, sure, most of the time we care about the future, but why not care about the past more? And then Lucretius's argument comes rearing back.